if we want to talk about movement in English, most of the time we can use the verb to go, and that works just fine. I went to China, I'm going to the shop, I went to school. But this doesn't give us much information about a trip and how it happened. So we don't know if someone is going on foot, if someone is going by car or by bike. This is how Russian is different. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Russian verbs of motion, and I will explain a topic which many Russian students find challenging. Let's get started. Unlike in English, Russian doesn't have a single verb which means to go. With Russian verbs of motion, you have to be more specific about how the movement happens. Namely, you need to specify two things: whether someone is going and coming back, so is it a return trip, or he is going for a single one-time trip, and number two, how that movement occurred. In the Russian language, we distinguish between one-time movement and repeated movement, also between movement in one direction and movement in both or many directions, as well as how the movement happened. So we distinguish between going on foot and using transport. So let's have a look at what does this mean. Let's imagine you want to say that you're now going to the supermarket. Я иду в магазин. This means that you're going on foot. You have used the verb идти. You're talking about one-time movement and movement in one direction, because you want to say that you're walking to the supermarket now, not every day. Even though it might be true that you're walking to the supermarket every day, that's not what we focus on in this sentence. So we will consider this as a one-time movement in one direction. Я иду в магазин. Now imagine you want to say that you walk to the supermarket every day. Я хожу в магазин каждый день. We have used a different verb for it, ходить. Even though the meaning of these two verbs, идти and ходить, is the same, they mean to go on foot. This time we've used the verb ходить, which we use to describe a repeated action, repeated movement, and logically movement in both directions. So every day I go to the supermarket, which means I go there and I come back. I go there and I come back. This is a repeated movement in both directions, there and back. We can notice that we have pairs of two verbs with identical meanings, but we use the first one to talk about one-time movements in one direction, and the second one to talk about movement in both directions or many directions, and also for repeated actions, for repeated movements. In the Russian language, we have 14 such pairs. And here on the screen, you can see the 14 pairs of basic Russian verbs of motion. So the first verb always expresses one-time movement and movement in one direction, while the second one will express movement in both directions or many directions or repeated movement. Now we saw what the verbs идти and ходить mean. These verbs mean to go on foot. Another verb which you'll be hearing very often is ехать, ездить, to go by transport. Let's have a look at two examples which will help us to better understand how to use these two verbs of motion. So we said that the first one, ехать, expresses movement in one direction or one-time movement, and the second one, ездить, expresses movement in two directions, both directions, there and back, or in many directions, and also expresses repeated actions, repeated movements. Let's have a look at these sentences. Я сейчас еду в университет. I am now driving to the university. So while in English we can just say go, I'm now going to the university, and this doesn't specify whether we go on foot or we drive there or we are just sitting in the car and somebody else is driving. In Russian we can say Я иду в университет, which means I'm walking to the university, and я еду в университет, which specifies that we are using transport. Let's compare this previous example to the next sentence. Каждый день я езжу в университет. Every day I drive to the university. Every day I go to the university by using some kind of transport. Now here we can specify я еду на машине, я еду на поезде, я еду на автобусе. Or я езжу на машине, я езжу на поезде, я езжу на автобусе. So ехать, I'm going in one direction. The action, the movement is happening at the moment of speaking, and this is a one-time movement. On the other hand, я езжу в университет каждый день. Every day I drive to the university. I go to the university by using some kind of transport. This is a movement in both directions, so it's a round trip. I go there and come back. I go there and come back every day. That's a repeated action, and it's an action in two directions. Now, what else should we know about the Russian verbs of motion? Well, you might be taught that since they express movement, Russian verbs of motion require the accusative case after them. But this is not quite correct because verbs of motion can be followed by many different prepositions. And we know that different prepositions require different cases. So when a verb of motion is followed by a preposition, we will use the case required by that specific preposition. Let me give you an example. Я иду в школу. We've used the accusative case after the preposition в because we express movement, and when the preposition в is used with movement, the noun, pronoun or adjective that follows will be in the accusative case. Я подошла к школе. Here we've used the dative case because the preposition к requires the dative case. Я подошла к чему? Я подошла к школе. And я отошла от школы. Я отошла от школы. We've used the genitive case because the preposition от requires the genitive case. Now, to all of these verbs of motion, we can add different prefixes which specify the direction of movement or its duration. I will not go into details about it in this video, but I will quickly show you how adding different prefixes can change the meaning of a verb of motion. Let's take the verb ходить. We can derive many different verbs from it by simply adding a different prefix. Походить, переходить, проходить, сходить, доходить, отходить, входить, уходить, выходить, обходить. You can find a free downloadable PDF including the conjugation of all of the basic verbs of motion, as well as examples and an exercise to test your knowledge by following the link in the description box. So let's sum it up. When we talk about general habits and regular trips, movements in both directions, so there and back, return trips, or movements in many directions, as well as when we talk about ability and habit, we will use the verbs from the group ходить. Каждый день он ходит в школу. Мы часто ходим в кино. Они ходили по городу. Я ездила в университет. Я могу ездить туда. On the other hand, when we talk about movements in one direction, movements which are happening at the moment of speaking, movements towards a specific goal or destination, as well as movements which occur at the same time with another action, we will use the verbs from the first group, the group идти. Мы едем в Москву. Мы идем в парк. Мы сейчас идем в школу. Когда я шла по дороге, шел дождь. Утром я еду на работу на автобусе. Когда я шла в школу, мне позвонил телефон. Please note that the Russian verbs of motion, besides describing movement, can also be used in a figurative sense. I'll talk about it in one of my next videos. I hope that this video helps you to better understand the Russian verbs of motion. Make sure to download a PDF which includes conjugation of all basic Russian verbs of motion together with examples and an exercise to test your knowledge. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time. Всем пока!